Could you imagine being a lighthouse keeper during a massive hurricane, a storm capable of flattening your entire structure? Well, this has been a grim reality for keepers over the centuries who would often risk, if not sacrifice, their own well-being through the worst possible situations, all in the name of providing safety to sailors and their precious freight, keeping all assets out of harm's way. With that in mind, the former Cape St. George Lighthouse might just offer the most extreme example of risks posed to lighthouse keepers. I'd even go as far as saying that this lighthouse was outright cursed. So join me to learn why, as today we discover the rise and fall of the Cape St. George Lighthouse, or as some have dubbed it, Florida's Forgotten Leaning Tower. I'm your host Ryan Socash, and you're watching It's History. Let's start off with some context. As you probably already know, the American South was one of the world's largest cotton producers throughout the early 19th century, resulting in material exports worldwide. However, there were logistical challenges. Farms were frequently up to 300 miles inland, so shipping large quantities before this part of the country was laden with rails took a lot of work. So, what was the solution to that problem? Well, rivers, of course. At peak production, over 50 fully loaded daily steamboats traversed the Apalachicola River from Columbus, Georgia, down the Gulf. Upon arrival, the so-called fluffy white gold was divided into bales, moved across the shallow bay to West Pass, and transferred onto massive ships bound for New England and Europe. To emphasize the scale of wholesale activity here, it's been estimated that in 1836 alone, over 50,000 bales were shipped from this area. This type of trade did wonders for local economy, and hence, to further facilitate growth, the territorial legislature secured $11,400 from Congress on March 3, 1831, to erect a lighthouse. Construction materials took time to come by, and the building phase took longer than expected, as bricks were mostly cannibalized from other discontinued lighthouse projects in the area. Even so, upon completion, the structure stood at 65 feet tall, looking over the sea. The original keeper, Francis Lee, lit the lamps for the first time on November the 16th, 1848. And then, almost immediately, disaster struck. In August of 1851, just 3 years after completion, a mighty gale toppled over the brand new lighthouse, and it was not an isolated case. The wind also demolished Bowdoin's Tower and a lighthouse on Dog Island. Considering the area's importance to commerce, a replacement lighthouse was built almost immediately, but this time it was 250 yards inland from the collapsed structure. Moreover, the tower would be built on pine pilings, rather than directly in the sand. The architects believed that this new location combined with a solid foundation could prevent history from repeating itself. And oh, how wrong they were. The replacement lighthouse was set up under the worst possible circumstances. The entire lighthouse was scrapped together using repurposed, sometimes even broken material from the predecessor. Then, just when operations were ready to resume, the Confederacy's Civil War effort confiscated and repurposed any valuable lighthouse equipment, including critical components like the lens. With that in mind, Keeper Braddock Williams was released from his duties, as without proper equipment, he couldn't do his job. It was just as well since the keeper's quarters were ramshacked during the conflict, with even the dwelling's door frames and windows removed. This state of affairs would finally change on August the 1st, 1861, when Keeper Braddock Williams returned to service. Braddock would stay until the responsibility was passed down to his son, Arid, in 1875, though this would also end in tragedy. In that same year, Arid fell from atop the lighthouse when painting and passed away just 4 hours later. This is when James A. Williams, Arid's older brother, took over and ran the lighthouse uneventfully for 18 years. At that time, he established a new keeper's dwelling that was said to be, quote, admirably adapt to its purpose. The lighthouse's troubled past seemed to be behind it for a time. By 1888, it had survived several hurricanes, had a fancy new lens, and its own dedicated oil house. As the decades passed and the turn of the century came and went, It almost seemed that the Cape St. George Lighthouse had reached a permanent state of stability, yet when the new keepers were employed, the unthinkable would happen. At this point in our story, a 60-year-old keeper named Thornton Cooper was serving the station, and the pressure of the job got the best of him. Everything unraveled when his wife went away for undisclosed reasons. Cooper, now living almost in total isolation and likely struggling from what transpired with his wife, sought the company of friends in Apalachicola, where he confessed his exhaustion, disappointment in life, and having to cook. Just 2 days later, he was found in his room with a bullet to the head. Not long after, the outbreak of World War II saw the lighthouse converted into a training area for troops who would eventually invade Europe, and it was at this time that a massive fire broke out, consuming the assistants' dwelling. As a result, the quarters were left empty and the oil lens was removed to be replaced with an automated system, but even that was done in vain, as the location's strategic importance was challenging. In 1954, the Army Corps of Engineers dug a channel known as Bob's Sides Cut through St. George Island. This channel provided direct access to the Gulf and effectively rerouted traffic by default. Then, in 1965, a bridge and causeway connected St. George Island to the mainland, making navigational access for freighters impossible. Finally, in 1977, Florida purchased Cape St. George and transformed it into a barrier island reserve. Considering nature preservation laws, this was the final nail in the coffin of freight passage, rendering the lighthouse entirely obsolete. But this isn't where our tale ends. To the contrary, things are about to go way off the rails. If you were paying attention earlier, you'll recall that the lighthouse was built inland to avoid being toppled over by the elements. Well, in 1852, it was 500 yards away from the waterline, but since barrier islands migrate over time, they lose mass in some areas. And so by 1990, beach erosion was so extreme that the lighthouse was practically in the water. Although it was recognized that the entire Gulf side of the island was under threat, authorities did not initially react. Then, in 1992, when Hurricane Andrew removed the entire buffer zone, the Coast Guard officially deactivated the light, perhaps signaling that a worst-case scenario was upon this fading lighthouse. Local fishermen, shrimpers, and yacht clubs tried to raise funds for recommission, but the Coast Guard did not change its position. This is when yet another blow came. 1995's Hurricane Andrew struck with tidal surges sweeping around the lighthouse. The water was so powerful, in fact, that it actually rose the structure from its old pine foundation. The tower settled into the sand, whereas a circular staircase was left behind, just being bashed by the waves. Anyhow, the oil house and the main dwelling were damaged so far beyond repair that apparently whatever remained was ultimately used as firewood. Anyhow, the scene was jarring. A completely unstable lighthouse leaning towards the sea. A local campaign called Save the Lighthouse was started almost immediately, and $250,000 was raised for restoration. Contractors arrived on the scene by 1999 with a low-tech system that could correct the lean. They removed sand from the high end and the tower just settled into a vertical position. Once in place, they retrofitted a new cement foundation, and although water would occasionally encircle the structure, it stayed in place. Even so, this was a temporary fix, as the beach continued to erode. Before long, the lighthouse stood in shallow water. The water rapidly destroyed the replacement foundation, and residents realized that to save their beloved tower, it would need to be moved inland as soon as possible. But unfortunately, Hurricane Dennis was much faster. On July the 10th, 2005, a Category 3 hurricane decimated the area. But when the storm receded, the lighthouse was still standing, albeit leaning even more dramatically than before. And here is where we reach the end of the story, as in October of that same year, in a rather unexpected or abrupt manner, the St. George Lighthouse toppled over into the sea and was lost forever. What remained of the lighthouse was recovered and loaded onto a barge in the hope of reconstruction. After several years passed, a museum, complete with an honorary lighthouse, was commemorated and opened to the public. Let's just hope that this time, the curse of the lighthouse is over. And with that, I thank you all for watching and hopefully subscribing. Otherwise, until next time, I'm Ryan Socash, signing off.